This week, Bob Martin from Miter Corporation is here with us to discuss all things supply chains and systems of trust. Stay tuned for Below the Surface.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
Welcome to Below the Surface, episode number 30, being recorded on Wednesday, May 22nd, 2024. Well, we're actually recording the week prior. It'll be releasing on May 22nd. I'm, of course, your host, Paul Asadorian, joined by Mr. Alan Alford. Alan, welcome.
Thank you, sir. Good to be here.
Yes, nice to have you as always. And before we get started, Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you'll find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, a customer case study with DigitalOcean is also there. And if you're interested in seeing a demo in our product, you can go to eclipsium.com/go. And today we're talking about, of course, supply chains and systems of trust. We're very excited to have Bob Martin. He's the Senior Principal Software and Supply Chain Assurance Engineer from Miter Corporation with us today. Bob has been there for a really long time and has a stellar career in information security, which you can read about in the show notes. I won't belabor everyone with all the details about your background, as most people know Bob from Miter. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Bob, it's great to have you here on our show today. And I guess I wanted to, I guess first describe your role at Miter so that folks know when we start asking questions about other Miter things that you don't work necessarily in those divisions, right?
Right. So I'm in what's called the Cyber Solutions Center. Basically, we focus on trying to help projects for our government customers, address cybersecurity type issues. I basically work outside that center in supply chain writ large. So I work across the company on issues either in software supply chain or other kinds of supply chain where many of the same problems are cropping up.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that come top of mind for me is when we talk about software supply chains, specifically, this could also apply to hardware and firmware as well, is that we have a lot of components that make up any given system, whether that's, hardware, software, and the combination thereof. And how do we track these vulnerabilities? CPE is obviously not under your direct control, Bob, right? But one of my thoughts is how can we use CPE to go, if there's a vulnerability in a library, such as libwebp was a shining example of this, how do we track
Yeah.
that and know what other software include that component and tie that vulnerability to the component rather than the software that includes that component?
Yep. Now the whole idea of I giving names to components,
Mhm.
pieces of software that are reused is one of the big issues facing us because um, people reuse names
Yeah.
across the whole cyberspace, and there's no central clearing spot for it. CPE has been an attempt to do that, and the trouble with it is you need somebody cranking the crank
Hmm.
to actually produce them, and that the only place we have that works in is DNS, where there's a central
Right.
place. All the others, sometimes skid along the rocks because they're not, funding and resources just aren't there. So there's some interesting papers that have come out of NTIA and out of CISA in the software bill of materials discussion about naming. And so there's some interesting approaches that they talk about. They examine all the current ways people are doing it, and they don't have an answer.
Mm,
And here's the solution, but it's a good understanding of what's in play in the marketplace and why we have these difficulties, and maybe a way of knitting them together.
right. Yeah, because even inside of an SBOM, you still have the naming collision problem. If I
Yep.
say my
Mhm.
software is using libwebp, but Alan's software is using libwebp, but maybe that's completely different libraries. We just happen to name them something the same.
Right. It's a good
Right.
name.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely. Um, sorry, Alan, did you have questions related to that?
Yeah, I'm just, I want to get into when we talk about common language and framework. So we've got CPE to try to sort of enumerate and get commonality on what we have.
Yep.
You guys have put together this system of trust framework to sort of get commonality on how we're fed, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but the system of trust framework, the idea there is I'm the consumer of a supply chain, and I'm going to my supply chain and saying, "Here's my questionnaires, here's my framework, here's my concerns. Address these according to
Well,
my view." Is that the right usage, or is the usage I'm part of your supply chain and
it
I'm
can
getting
be
into it?
both. It's
Okay.
basically from the perspective of what are the risks that can come from your supply chain. So it's
Mhm.
a catalog. It's a language for us to talk about those risks, whether it's from the supplier themselves or
Mhm.
an item of supply like a product, component, or it could be from a service, cloud service, or in fact, warehousing as a service, trucking as a service, all those kinds of things. But whereas that's, the consumer thinking about their suppliers, it's also a good tool for a supplier to look at what are they doing, what are they addressing, and are they on top of their game in a way that they hope to be. So
Right.
it can be used both ways. And, you know, like the attack framework, it gives both parties a way of knowing they're talking about the same stuff rather than
Mhm.
talking past each other. And it also lets people have a place to come learn what is the space, what are the risks that they may want to consider, may want to address, so that they don't call something a black swan when everyone else has been seeing it in their backyard for the last 10
Right.
years.
So the theme really is commonality of terminology, commonality of purpose.
Yep. And the other part of system of trust does it adds to that. um, Down in the weeds you get to, well, what is a measurable risk? Because having this wonderful language to talk about risks, but not what is it I'm actually establishing is there or not there, is tough, right? So we're adding, we call them risk factors, but it's basically the measurable risk, and then we're giving you ideas of data driven questions that would establish that existence of that risk. So we're not talking about likelihoods or probabilities. We're talking about go get this data and do this kind of review of it and you'll get an answer. So the questions are yes no questions that tell
Mhm.
you what to go look for and how to interpret it. So the questions are pretty tough because that's your subject matter expertise, is what to go look for and how to interpret it to tell you whether it's high risk, low risk, no risk, whatever. So we're trying to build that all into this. So at the top level, it's a language, but at the bottom, it's what data should I get and how should I interpret it? That's just another facet of what we're trying to do, because a lot of people don't know how to identify or assess whether a risk is present or not,
Mm,
and so we're trying to give you that guidance. And some of them you can go out, search public websites if you're trying to see if the company is on a sanctions list or something like that. or you can get commercial data sources where they can tell you other details that may be, you know, kind of the due diligence kinds of questions about a company. Or you can do that on a product too, right? There's people
Right.
that publish websites about that. But not everything that you think of as a risk is going to have that published public or privately curated data available. It's still a risk though. So we're trying to give guidance on, well, how would you get that data? Maybe it's a test procedure. Maybe it's a, on-site visit. It could be anything, but we're going to try to give that guidance so that we have some reason behind what we're saying is a risk. It's hopefully defendable that, hey, I looked at all this stuff and I found no data to say that we have this. And then the next day we get hit, from behind the head. But
Right.
at least you can show what you did and why you believed you were in a good place as to that particular risk.
Mm. Yeah, and I just want our audience to know that sot.miter.org is the website for the project that we're talking about that Bob is obviously heavily
Yeah.
involved in.
And,
Yep.
and And on that site is a lot of good data, but also there's one place where it talks about there's a menu called RMM, Risk Model Manager. You can actually get an account. It's basically our content management
Mhm.
system, only you only have read
Mm.
access if you
Mhm.
go in.
Right.
But the thing that that tool lets you see is the current content. The website gets updated, but not quite as quickly as that does. And that tool also addresses, and it's a prototype, by
Mhm.
the way, a cloud native app. But the other part of this is I get this huge pile of potential risks. Oh my God, I can't evaluate all of those. So we have the idea that you would have a context. You're trying to make a decision, you're trying to make a choice, you're trying to work through something so you can winnow down to the risks that are pertinent to that decision, that technology, your aversion to risk or sensitivity, and the amount of time and resources you have. And we call that a profile. And so this content management tool has a second mode where you can go in and radio button in and out whole parts of the catalog
Mm.
so that you can come down to what you're actually going to use. And it used to be able to pop out a spreadsheet. You could go do that offline evaluation because we don't want you doing it on our
Mm.
iron. But um, we broke that when we moved to graph store data stores in the back end. So we'll get that
Mm.
fixed. But the idea here is look at it all, get to understand it, figure out which makes sense for the decisions you're trying to make, then use that to go do assessments and hopefully have data to support your yes no questions.
Yeah, Bob, so the NIST, CSF 2.0 offers guidance on largely what I would if I were to, like, 50,000-foot view, is create a supply chain risk management program. And so once you've
Right.
consumed that and prioritize that in your organization, I'm assuming a good next step is to go to the system of trust and start
Right.
executing that,
Well,
right? Is that
so
how you would
right.
frame it?
So both that framework and this special pub on supply chain
Mhm,
161, it they tell you the process.
mhm,
What activities should you do, how you should organize it, um, but they don't tell you which risks to manage because they
Mm.
couldn't.
mhm,
Right? There's not one list of risks, as I was just saying. So we're collecting the overall list, and then you pick out the subset you're going to use for a particular project decision, and then that guidance from NIST helps you have the organization that can do something about those
right,
risks.
right. Yeah, so it's a little more detail on the things you should be concerned about and how to assign risk to those things that you're concerned about.
Yeah. Versus how to organize the team. What are the different
Right,
roles?
right.
Right.
How do you do it consistently over time? And
Yep.
Yep.
And my own risk appetite informs all of that.
Yes. And yours is probably different than mine.
Yeah, I can
You're
see
probably
that
not
because
worried about snowstorms, right?
right. We were talking about this in a hardware context, and I think it's relevant to think about different types of supply chains. And
Yep.
I always wondered why someone would get a model laptop, right, and say this is great, and another person has the same exact model laptop, and they're like, "Well, it's terrible. Like I had to RMA it." And I believe some of those problems stem from the supply chain and hardware, where manufacturers somewhere along the supply chain get a batch of capacitors, let's say, and those capacitors are not to spec as some other capacitors. They end up in the supply chain and they end up in a certain modeled laptop, right, for a certain period of
Right.
time until they correct the issue. And so I'm assuming
Yeah.
System of Trust has
Well,
helped me think about those scenarios wherever
right.
I am in the
About
supply chain and how to deal with that, right?
right. It could be a tolerance or it could be
Mhm.
quality,
Mhm.
right? And it could be, the exact same pieces, but when you pull from the different bins and put them together, all the tolerances may match up and work perfectly, or all the
Mhm.
tolerances may match up and no signal gets through,
Right,
right?
right.
So, because we don't make things exact, we're a lot of electronic components and physical mechanical ones
Mhm.
have some tolerances. And, within that quote approved range, you can match things up and there's a lot of slop and
Right,
everything doesn't work right. Or they tend to, on average, work together.
right. I feel like
Just look
you
at
could
the
almost say the
things.
same thing about software maybe.
Yep. How much do you vet your input and
Mhm.
against what range, and versus how precisely does the thing calling it adhere to that API? And the two may fit, or they two could go south every other time.
Yeah, and it's interesting to as a consumer, when I say consumer, I think we're using the word consumer as you're an enterprise or, company that's consuming goods or you're an individual, right? I think we kind of use that term interchangeably. How do you put the right requirements on your suppliers, knowing there's things like variances and all these different suppliers? Like where do you go to get requirements for I want to acquire this for my project. What requirements should I put on my suppliers?
Right. So when it comes to functionality and those kinds of issues, don't come to system of
Yeah.
trust. Basically, there you want to get into the science of whatever it is you're building, the engineering tolerance. What are the appropriate variances, and you need to understand the industry that is producing these and how they package them and how they test them. And in fact, my very first professional job, I was still in school, but I worked at Eastman Kodak at the Kodak Park in Rochester, and I was basically replacing under maintenance approach components in the control systems that they had. Now these were all analog, and so they had built this, had been running for 5 years. It was time to do a refresh, and I'm sitting here going through catalogs trying to find parts that have the right
Mm,
tolerance, the right voltage, the right temperature range, the right vibration tolerance. And boy, they were all over the place. So you had to really know that area
mhm,
to get the right things. So I think that is true of almost every industry.
mm,
But when it comes to risks that come from your supply chain, especially security or safety or reliability or availability, resilience, those are the things that System of Trust addresses. And you'll see that in its structure. Basically, the three aspects: supply, service, and supplier risks have top level categories. There's seven for supplier, four for both service and item of supply. that top level category, we believe, is the level the board officers of a
Mhm.
company should be versed in. And then down a couple more levels, it still is independent of what kind of industry you're in. But then below that, you start, like if you're dealing with counterfeit, at the top level, counterfeit is counterfeit. But then oh, I'm in the handbag industry. So how do I test for counterfeit handbags versus counterfeit chip versus counterfeit
Mm.
sushi
Mhm.
versus counterfeit software. There'll be very different measures that you want to use, but managing the idea of counterfeit, that can be directed more consistently across
Mm.
industries. So another aspect of system of trust we think is going to be, kind of a standard of due diligence for the board and officers, being aware of all these kinds of risks and what they could, ground into at the measurable level in their industry.
Alan, you had a question about, roles and responsibilities in the supply chain, which I think is good time to ask that.
Yeah, I think this is a good time for that one. So, I'm gonna tell a brief story back when I worked in manufacturing in the telecommunications industry, and Heartbleed came out.
Mm,
And we had to do the due diligence as the manufacturer to figure out, do we have this vulnerability? Oh my goodness, we do. It's everywhere. And we released, I don't know, whatever. I'm going to make up numbers now. We had 100 products and 80 of them had the Heartbleed vulnerability. We made the call as the manufacturer to go ahead and patch stuff that we had previously declared was end of life because this was such an egregious security vulnerability. But that led me down the rabbit hole of what about all these customers of mine that are deliberately on really old gear that are refusing to update, don't care, plugged into the internet when I told them not to, without a firewall, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, it got into a whole question about ownership and obligation and responsibility, right?
yep.
If we are a consumer of the supply chain, we have certain things we have to do. If we are a provider in the supply chain, there's certain things we ought do and maybe could do or should do, or at least would be nice to do. I just where's your take on all that? Like the responsibility quotient and the ownership quotient, like how do we break that down in a meaningful way with us? Some kind of framework where we can all agree to terms.
Well, one, kudos to your company that your software was updatable. There are still devices out on the internet today that have Heartbleed, but most of them is because they can't be updated. So, um, I think the question of, accountability in software has been one that's festered and bubbled around for a long time. If you remember, you have this wonderful thing called a EULA, the end user license agreement, and eh, since I've seen commercial software, they've always said, this is not warranted for anything. Um, you know, take it at your own risk, which kind of leaves the bar pretty low for responsibility. And I think that's one of the things you're seeing today is the world we have is a result of that, in that, oh, they find an issue, and out of the goodness of their heart or the pressure from their customers, they provide an update, and now you have to patch, and you have to make sure the patch didn't break anything and it's still all configured correctly. So there's a lot of weight on the end user to keep up with this flow of updates and corrections. Whereas if there had been more emphasis in the producer of making sure the software was reliable and secure, and these things didn't escape out into the world, or rather, when they did, it was an escape, rather a normal part of their business, um, then we'd have more of the responsibility on the producer. And I think that's what you're seeing in the government right now, is saying, hey, the market forces aren't correct.
Right.
We need to intervene. That there's too much of the burden is on the users of software who in many cases are totally unprepared to do the patching and even understand why they're patching. Whereas those who created the product can be argued to have reasons to have known or should be able to, address those things. And so that's where I see things going. I've had a briefing that I've been giving for 15 years that compares the building industry with the software industry. And, the building industry, there was a king back in biblical times who, said if a law that if a building is built and it falls and kills someone, the builder will be put to death. And that was actually carved in
Mm.
rock. Um, that kind of prompted a due diligence and due care in the building industry. And nowadays, you always see when something goes wrong, studying it, what went wrong, how do we make sure we don't have that happen again? There's all kinds of material science going on that really was started because of that. Oh, we got to make sure the material is up to the job when we use it in buildings. We don't have that in software.
Mhm.
Oh, there's a new compiler. Okay, there's a new language. Oh, there's a new framework. Well, nobody tests it to see if it's secure, safe, reliable, performant, can scale or anything. Oh, you just start using it because it's a new thing, and we got to keep the developers interested in new stuff. And that culture, a lot of people enjoyed it, but given where software plays a role in our lives these days, I think there's a different level of tolerance we need to expect.
Do you see regulation playing a big role in that? Or what role, I should say, what role do you regulation play with software in
I don't know. I mean, in the medical
Mhm,
world, there's some industries that are already regulated and they have been getting better at how they do that regulation. I'm not a fan of
mm,
big government, but if the market forces fail, then it is government's role to come in and readjust the equation. So maybe it will have some regulations. I don't know.
yeah. I think we've already started seeing that in other countries, right? The UK passing a law about passwords and authentication on IoT devices and EU CRA. It's
Yep.
starting to happen. The FDA is a great example right here in the US.
Yep. But I really don't like to see lawyers and legislative bodies weighing into a
Mm,
technology because it takes them a long time to do something and they can't do the fine details. So how do you do it in a way that they can have effective regulations and laws? Probably need to get into the industry doing the details because things change so fast. But I'm not an expert in
right,
that
right.
area at all.
I wanted to transition. We've talked a little bit about hardware and software, but I was reading an article about someone that discovered a bug in OpenSSL in Debian's implementation of it in 2008, and folks created keys based on that vulnerability in OpenSSL in 2008, and those keys still exist today. So the question is, Bob, how do we manage and allow people with have better utilities and information about, oh, I need to regenerate this key? How do we apply this to the crypto systems?
Yeah, I mean, awareness that your system actually is using cryptography is severely lacking.
Okay, so it's not just
Um,
me. I
you
thought the
know,
same thing. Hey, yeah.
yeah. Well, in fact, at RSA, there was a couple people talking about some efforts that are going on. Here's another acronym: C
Mhm.
bombs, cryptography bombs.
Mhm.
So it basically is a riff on a software bill of material where it would list out within the things that are in your software, which crypto libraries or versions of cryptos they're using, just so you're aware when somebody gives an advisory that, that first quantum computer is now
Right.
here and all the following crypto is needs to be replaced. How do you know if you
Mhm.
got it right?
Right.
So we've never had that mechanism. It's the same thing with AI and data sets. Those can have vulnerabilities too, right? How do we share those? How do we even know what versions of AI were used? And so there's efforts on an AI
Mhm.
bomb to help track and give provenance and pedigree and information about that. And you know, AI, it's software. So it'll get CVEs. It should have CWEs for the types of things that you want developers to avoid. And, so there was a good workshop off site at RSA where we worked through some of those and had a good discussion about, there's a nice pipeline up to the CIO level and the CISO level with CVE and CWE and CVSS and EPSS and all that. Don't try to create it
Mhm.
again. It's 25 years and going for that pipeline to you know do what it's doing now, and it's still got room to improve. But boy, don't start another one.
Yeah, I
Right.
agree with you, Bob, and and this ties into supply chains, right? Because supply chains give us different types of vulnerabilities that we've kind of talked about already. But what I don't want is everyone start creating new frameworks for tracking and measuring vulnerabilities. I don't think we
Right.
need that.
No,
We have
Right.
a good system for that. Again, I agree. It's not without its faults, and I evangelized this when I talked at B-Sides Charm last month. I said, look, we don't need to poo-poo it. We all need to work together to make it better, right? And I think we need to
right.
have a one set of these tracking and scoring mechanisms rather than 25 of them, because that does us a disservice as well.
Yeah, I mean, the academic of, oh, I'm going to come up with a better
Hmm.
process and I'll prove that it's better. It's like that doesn't help us. We've got the mechanisms moving here. Tell us which gears to replace, which, where to add in a new feature, how to evolve what we've got.
Yeah.
And especially in the space where you're going across
Hmm.
professions. You've got software developers, you've got network people, you've got communication specialists, you got the management of companies, all of them kind of aligning and using this as a communication vehicle to understand what's going on, what went wrong, and where I can get guidance on how to fix it. Okay, let's make that
Hmm.
better. If it doesn't address open source well enough, great. Let's figure out how to evolve it. If it, doesn't address hardware, oh wait, now it does.
Right.
So
Right.
that was a 5-year journey of talking with the people in the microelectronics world. I started talking to them, oh Lord, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, and at the time the researchers in that area, they would find issues and they tried to report them and they'd get a letter from the company's lawyer.
Hmm.
Wow, that's so
Yep.
1990,
Mhm.
yeah, in the software world. And so I educated them about how it could be and, you know, got the companies to think about, don't you want weaknesses about that result in these kinds of vulnerabilities captured, educated to your engineers, tools, learning how to find them before they escape into
Hmm.
production? And in the hardware world, that's even more
Oh yeah,
expensive.
yeah. It's
Right.
more important,
Yeah,
right?
and so they turned around fairly quickly. And so now in CWE, you've got a whole crew of people capturing what can go wrong in microelectronics.
Yep.
and
And
I expect the same thing to happen in AI
Mhm.
models.
we started the conversation with commonality of terminology, right? Like that's and now we're talking about commonality of purpose.
Yep.
And I think it's the same fundamental thing, right? Like
Yeah.
what we're trying to say is I don't care who you are or what you are. AI, great. So there's a bazillion different AIs now. Okay, each one has a different thing, each one has a different component, each one has a we just need to learn that commonality of terms, common terminology, but the commonality of purpose should already really be there and we should be able to just get on board and go, right?
Yeah, I mean, because we all want these things to work and work for their intended purpose. And, when there's flaws in them, when they can't be configured right, when they come out of the box, configured poorly or whatever, those are all interrupting the ability of the thing to do what you thought it was going to do for you. Or, so these things all line up. I mean, the whole work that now CIS has about hardening guidance, that started out because the Air Force was having their annual red teaming from NSA, and they were keep finding the same
Mhm.
problems. Well, that's because nobody was giving them guidance on how to address this systematically at scale. And so the whole guidance on how to harden systems and how to configure them went out. But then eventually we got people saying, well, why do I have to do this when I receive the product? Why can't it come that
Right.
way so that it's installed secure and safe? And so we've evolved over time. It's not everyone does that.
Well, it's gotten
No, I'm
better.
saying not everyone does that,
Yeah.
but more and more people are doing that.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
like to pick on the I don't wanna say it's picking on, right? But if we look at the past, let's say, year, on VPN type appliances, right? And
yeah,
I know you're not authorized to speak, about the incident that happened at MITRE. So if the audience is wondering why we're not talking about that, Bob's not authorized to speak about it. So that's fine. We
well, and
accept
there's
that.
some nice blogs about
Yeah,
it.
and
They
there
can
is some
read a
right,
lot.
and but to Bob's point, there is information that has been published about it. But that's an area where I'm buying this appliance to, do something for my
Yep,
network, right, for my enterprise or my company, and I wanna have this expectation that it's gonna be more secure than it is today, and we've got a long list of CVEs that go across all different vendors, not picking at any particular one, certainly. It goes across all different vendors, and I think the enterprises are saying, "Well, why can't this come more hardened?" Right? To
yep.
me, I think some of the answers are user experience, support, things like that. I don't know what your thoughts are on
Well,
that.
and also a lot of these, are startups
Mhm,
that are now making good product and they're evolving. So they're not like, the big, companies that made mainline operating systems and databases and,
mhm,
the big network fabric manufacturers. It took them a long time to learn how to secure their products and to deliver them in a way that could be secure. So you get someone who's, oh, I'm going to, bring this technology from some PhD thesis that will, really revolutionize this area, and they don't necessarily know how to develop secure product
mhm.
or, provision them, because that wasn't part of the business plan that they put in front of the venture capitalists.
Right, right.
But we should make that need to be this high to get on the ride type of thing, and that's, I think, where
Mhm.
the government is leaning towards, because you don't want things sloppily built that could cause critical harm to an organization or to individuals. I
Mm,
mean, how much of your life is you bumping into software driven capabilities that you don't want them to work incorrectly
right, right.
because they could hurt you
Yeah, and those safety
or your
standards
or your
is a
house.
good starting place, Bob. I completely agree. But when we get to
Yep.
software, it's that ever-changing landscape and updatability that I think is critical. And a lot of the regulations that we've seen also include, well, there has to be some mechanism to update that. And then I think,
Well, in
Alan, you had
fact,
questions on, like, how long should we up that be updatable,
well,
right?
before we get into
Mm,
how
Yeah.
long, you remember I Am the Cavalry,
yeah.
Josh
Oh, yeah,
Corman?
Josh, a good friend of
I
mine, yeah.
mean, that was the whole thing is there was classes of software, there was no way to update,
Right.
never mind any ability to see what was in it. So, that's definitely a problem.
Mhm.
Yep. Yeah, we're back to the earlier conversation about obligations of manufacturer versus obligations of consumer, and we elected to do post end of life, like we went back through what we had already declared to be end of life and patched some heartbleed for some folks. But at some point, it's got to stop, right?
Yep.
I mean, when I've got customers that are using a 15-year-old device, and the last update I released was 7.5 years ago. Great. I'm glad I built something sturdy and
Right.
hardy that's still going, but am I obligated to maintain that sucker? Like,
Yeah.
come on.
Yeah, and I don't think legally you are. Morally, you may feel that way, but this is again, if you look at um, all the managers that were trained and got their role before 1995, they software was not a thing that they knew about. Their company didn't depend on it as far as they were concerned, and the first time they realized they were was the
Yeah, I was gonna say it
Y2K
was
incident,
Y2K.
when all of a sudden they said, "What do you mean I got to
Mhm.
spend all this money replacing stuff? When I put stuff in, it just is in. It's there. It's a physical thing, right?"
It
Well,
worked
no,
when I
it has
sold it.
this software piece
Mm,
that uh, and that just blows their brains apart because they didn't understand and they didn't have a gut feel for things that aren't just like a brick. You put it in, it's there. And operational technology has been the same
mm.
way. It was a capital of expense, over a 10-year, amortization period. What do you mean you should be patching it and updating it every couple of weeks or months or whatever? It's just a different paradigm. And yet, all of these industries have been bringing software into their capabilities because it makes it more flexible. They can expand it, they can do things that it wasn't originally going to. Well, there's a other side to that equation, that responsibility to make sure it can be updated, but I don't think it's forever. I don't think, we have to figure out, and that's probably some mixture of market and government about what's fair and balanced. Not that the government can figure that out,
Mhm.
but the market should be able to figure it out. And what's interesting is, you always have an option. If you want to abandon it, you could open source the code. There may be somebody willing to come in
Right.
and make updates. That's the interesting part of open source is just because a project is abandoned doesn't mean it's dead.
Right.
Somebody may said, I'm dependent on that, and I'm going to start doing maintenance on it and
Well, we talk
fixing.
about that intersection of private and public. We talk about open source specifically. I heard a really interesting one just last week. This idea that commonly used open source frameworks might be better secured by government than by private sector. In other words, if we're all using it and we know it's everywhere and it's making the entire world vulnerable, what if the government stepped in and provided the security for that
Or
code?
the funding for that project to be yeah,
Or the
yeah.
funding, yeah, well, yeah, I don't want yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I
exactly.
was going to
And
say,
I'm
I'd
not
like
talking about bureaucrats
the,
actually coding, but the idea that the government would fund, like, "Hey, this is something." It's kind of the tragedy of the commons story, right? Like,
yep,
we're all using this, but it's in someone's interest, all of our interest to secure it, and yet no one of us is securing it. What if the government funded the
Mhm.
securing of it?
yep.
Just an
Well, and
interesting
all
model.
we already have, some industry players that I think it's Tidelift that actually does try to do some of that. That they
Mhm.
take money, bring it to projects
Yeah,
that are critical to many areas. So the private industry has been doing some of that, but there's quite a bit of software that we all depend on that isn't in that rescue column yet.
right. And And then you get into the complex supply chain of that and all the components that make up that
Yeah,
software,
and
right?
somebody knowing that there's a
Mhm.
better version.
Right. Right.
Well, and that's another thing I want to rail about is repositories that keep serving up vulnerable versions. Just because people want it doesn't mean you should give it to them.
Yeah. There has been a
You should
history of that.
force them to move.
Right. And
Yeah,
that's one
so
of the double-edged swords, I think, of open source is something can be abandoned, but anyone can fork it and move it forward.
yes.
And is that the right decision, I think is what you're hitting on, Bob, right? Not always.
Well, no, well, what I'm saying is all the code repos that serve up, you know, multiple versions of a
Mhm.
project, and people are they complain that people are still downloading the vulnerable versions. Why aren't they getting
Right, right.
the secure version? Well, maybe it's the API would change and they have to code
Mhm.
a little differently. They'd have to test because it may perform differently and could have race condition or whatever. But why aren't we forcing them to do that versus allowing them to continue
Mm.
to bring down known vulnerable code?
Right, and we see that in the
It's like,
commercial software certainly as well.
yep. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I've
No,
worked with
it's
software companies where we're like, "Oh, we do the audit," and it's like, well, a certain percentage, a low percentage of our customers, but still customers are using versions that are 10 years old. And we don't necessarily want to, have those uncomfortable conversations, right? And force people and make our customers upset. Certainly, that's not a good business model. But at some point, there has to be a line, right?
yeah, I mean they somehow they aren't grasping the implication
Mhm.
of not moving to a more secure version. And maybe things like the vex, the vulnerability
Mhm.
exploitability, maybe that'll help, because then you can point to a vex report that will say, hey, yes, there's a component that has a known CVE in it, but the way we use it, it's not vulnerable, it's not exploitable.
Right.
And therefore, you don't have to go waste time trying to get people to update that module. Whereas something else that, yes, you have that library, and guess what? You have an open
Right.
door.
Right.
You're exploitable. That's where you should focus. And as SBOMs get into the market, more and more people are going to be noticing what components are in their
Mhm.
software and have those questions. And that was the point of Vex, is to allow suppliers of software to make statements that are machine parsable, that you know get flagged for known CVE and component, match against Vex that says it's not exploitable,
Mm.
move on.
Mhm.
Because really, all these bills of materials are best used by machines, not by
Yeah. No,
humans.
I agree.
Um,
I've seen the reports. I've done some of the work, and it's exactly to your point, Bob. That's an important aspect of it is that I can look inside of a firmware and go, wow, it's got 14,000 or 1,400 vulnerabilities, let's say, and I can go, well, I'm looking at the list. I'm not sure how many of those are exploitable, right? But I need a machine to tell me more of which ones are in use, which
which
ones, how they're
ones
in
and
use,
how.
yeah, and do that analysis, and then I can make the informed risk decision.
Yep, they support you in your managing of that
Right,
product.
right. And I think it's a mindset thing as well, perhaps, that needs to change. I think a lot of us have been around technology for a long time that are managing and maintaining these systems, and we've been burned by updates and new
Oh yeah.
technology, right? And so we're hesitant to go, well, let's go to the latest version. But I think somehow we have to start getting over that. But we don't go you go too far
Well,
to
I
the
mean,
extreme and it can be disruptive, right? You run that operational risk.
I don't know about you, but I've noticed that a lot of the mainline software producers are getting much, much better at producing
Yeah.
updates that
That don't
don't
that's a
disrupt.
huge part of it. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm no longer terrified to update my OS on an auto update
yeah,
cycle, right? Like every operating system in my house is auto updating,
yep,
and I used to be terrified to do that.
yep, I used to also. It used to be, and my wife, her career was software testing.
Mhm, mhm,
Software automated regression test
mhm,
frameworks, and so I, not only as a user of software, but I watched all the things she would find in testing, and you know
Mhm,
obviously the developers at some point weren't actually, oh, it compiled,
right, right,
that no functional testing done. That's another group.
mhm,
But the other thing that's going on is, the whole um, attestation. If you're selling to the government, that you need to attest that you've followed the NIST secure software development framework concepts. I think that there's, a lot of people are signing that PDF, but what are they doing inside? I don't know about your experience with senior executives, but when they have to sign something that could put them in jail, they want a little
mhm,
data to support that position. So I'm seeing a lot of organizations trying to organize and make available the data that supports, yes, we did
mhm,
that. And that's actually bringing a lot of interest in the IETF SCIT work, supply chain
mhm,
integrity, transparency, and trust, which is meant to let you have, basically an append only log. You could say, you know, um, distributed ledger, you could say blockchain, whatever, but some way that you put in data, who put it in. It's about, what you tested, the SBOM of it, the who developed it, what's our training, what tools were used to build it, what was the configuration, all the things that later you would say, yeah, I did the right thing, I tested the right way, I have a secure, safe, reliable version. Well, you're putting this in the log as you build it, as you're in your factory, and then you make it available to customers on a permission basis if they need the raw data.
mhm,
Or you could have a third party come in and look at that raw data and make some statement about
mhm,
that and make that available. But the idea of having this available in a standard API so that no matter who your supplier is, you have a standard way of getting it. And no matter what customer comes to you, you have a standard way of answering versus all the questionnaires and tests that they ask for now, is an interesting dynamic.
mhm,
And I think needing to sign those attestation forms is generating a desire for that in industry for their own sanity.
mhm.
Do this in an economical way.
yeah, I think that speaks to the CISO, responsibilities that we've seen, Alan, right?
Indeed.
That's a hot topic in the CISO community.
I'm one of those execs who doesn't wanna sign the thing
Without
without
knowing,
knowing.
right, right.
Yes, right, and you don't want your crew to, every time they're scrambling and they're making up reports to back up what they're telling you. No, no, no. I want,
Yeah.
you said you built this back on August 16th in 2022. Where's the data from
Mhm,
then about what you
Yeah.
did? That
Yeah.
I'll believe, you know, not the stuff that you just genned up yesterday, which of course is what everybody did for a common criteria. You
mhm,
know, you, you built the product, then you genned up the stuff that supports the test. No, that's not the way to do it. It's very expensive. Never mind, who knows if it's really what
mhm.
happened.
Awesome. Anything else you wanna share with our audience, Bob?
No, I think the skit was the one thing we hadn't really touched on, but we danced around edges
Mm,
of it. Yeah, that's what I wanted to get on there. And anyone who wants to get involved in System of Trust, come to that website, get an account, play with it. we actually have a community page of the companies that are helping already, and we've got over 65 companies. We just brought Boeing and the Chertoff Group on. So it's a lot of good eyes or good hands helping along.
Awesome. Well, Bob, thank you very much for appearing on this edition of Below the Surface. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.